Good evening from Westminster, where the highest court in the United Kingdom has delivered a devastating ruling for Boris Johnson and for his government. 11 justices of the UK Supreme Court agreed unanimously that the Prime Minister's decision to ask the Queen to suspend Parliament for 5 weeks was unlawful. And the judges took the view that the suspension was designed to frustrate Parliament from scrutinising the government as the Brexit deadline approaches. And they declared that the suspension had had an extreme effect on our democracy. The House of Commons will now resume its business tomorrow morning. And Boris Johnson, who's been in New York at the United Nations today, says he strongly disagrees with the ruling. His opponents, including Labour's Jeremy Corbyn, have called on him to resign. Our political editor Laura Kuenssberg reports on today's hugely significant ruling by the Supreme Court.
The storm burst, well and truly. Campaigners and lawyers gathering at the highest court in the land.
He thinks we've won. I really hope so.
Ready to pass judgment on the Prime Minister. When it came, the ruling was polite, but devastating too.
Miller and Prime Minister
Boris Johnson broke the law.
The decision to advise Her Majesty to prorogue Parliament was unlawful because it had the effect of frustrating or preventing the ability of Parliament to carry out its constitutional functions without reasonable justification.
Jubilation outside in the rain.
Restores some kind of hope, doesn't it?
Who needs hard booze, right, when you've got a judgment like that?
Those outraged the Prime Minister had advised the Queen to suspend or prorogue Parliament for 5 weeks.
Do this now!
Suspicious he'd done it to close down debate on Brexit, which he denied.
The effect on the fundamentals of our democracy was extreme. No justification for taking action with such an extreme effect has been put before the court.
The conclusion? It was illegal, so it never happened at all.
The Prime Minister's advice to Her Majesty was unlawful, void and of no effect. Parliament has not been prorogued.
The government's lawyers a few weeks ago did not expect this. The court's traditionally allergic to politics and stay well away. But the other side's legal dream came true.
The ruling today speaks volumes. This Prime Minister must open the doors of Parliament tomorrow. MPs must get back and be brave and bold in holding this unscrupulous government to account. Thank you.
So what next? Immediate calls to New York, 3,000 miles away, for the Prime Minister's audacious move condemned by the court.
Prime Minister, are you going to resign?
To be a reason to resign.
Prime Minister. Thank you very much, Anthony.
For some of his allies, though, it's no emergency.
There's been a court case in our country this morning, which I think one or two of you may have picked up on the...
Another chance to suggest the establishment is trying to stop him.
I have the highest respect, of course, for our judiciary and for the independence of our courts, but I must say I strongly disagree with this judgment. And we in the UK will not be deterred from getting on and delivering on the will of the people to come out of the EU on October the 31st.
Boris Johnson, have you embarrassed the Queen?
But one Number 10 source told me the Supreme Court has made a serious mistake extending its reach into political matters.
To the Queen. When are you going to go and face the comments, sir?
Attacking the judiciary when Downing Street and him are under attack themselves. Back across the Atlantic, every politician's trying to peer into the future. The opposition sniff opportunity.
The Supreme Court has just announced its decision.
The Labour leaders' conference in Brighton disrupted and delighted by the news.
And it shows that the Prime Minister has acted wrongly in shutting down Parliament. It demonstrates a contempt for democracy and an abuse of power by him. And I invite Boris Johnson, in the historic words, to consider his position.
Johnson out! Johnson out!
Johnson out, they chanted. One member of the government told the BBC the Prime Minister should quit. But that's far from widespread in Tory circles at this stage. Instead, MPs replacing the tourists in the House of Commons, taking their seats on the green benches themselves.
There are still quite a few tourists in the chamber. I'm just talking to colleagues and trying to find out what exactly we're going to be doing, but we need to go back to holding the government to account.
I'm just in a taxi going back to Parliament. Parliament should never have been suspended. It was not suspended, and therefore we should be back in there doing our jobs, holding him to account.
The official invitation on this crazy day was issued with customary formality.
Please come to this red one.
Last minute pomp in the rain.
I have instructed the House authorities to prepare not for the recall, the prorogation was unlawful and is void, to prepare for the resumption of the business of the House of Commons. The House of Commons sits tomorrow and that it does so at 11:30 a.m.
But once MPs have raced back here tomorrow, what will they actually do? The alliance of former Tories, still rebels, might try to take control again after the government's approach went so wrong.
That advice was clearly very poor, and I think some of his advisers are going to have to leave.
And they're still coordinating with the opposition parties.
He does not want to be held to account. He does not want to have to answer questions about his disastrous Brexit policy. And in doing so, he was prepared to mislead the Queen and indeed to mislead the whole country.
If Boris Johnson won't do the decent and honourable thing, then I think Parliament has a duty to come together to force him out of office through a vote of confidence.
There's no sign of that, though.
I'll tell you, I know him well. He's not going anywhere. Don't worry about him.
And look who is in Boris Johnson's corner.
It's just another day in the office.
Yeah, well, tomorrow is another day in Parliament. That's what that is.
A place in power he might have dreamt of for years. But after only 2 months, it's proving harder than perhaps he thought it looked.
Well, Laura's with me now outside Parliament. Let's just reflect on what today has meant and the fact that it was a jaw-dropping moment in the Supreme Court.
It really was. I mean, today is a momentous decision, and it is a real humiliation for a Prime Minister whose lawyers did not think a few weeks ago that they would end up in this position. Far from it. I mean, they knew, I think, that what they hoped to do with the suspension of Parliament might prove politically controversial, but they thought legally that it was watertight. They did not think it would be controversial. And yet here we have the highest court in the land finding against a serving Prime Minister. That is a huge moment, not just for Boris Johnson, but for the country. We've never seen anything like this happen before in recent times. But of course, when it comes to the politics, does it make a substantial difference immediately? The opposition does not want to push right now for a vote of no confidence, which would be their way of actually trying to get him out. And Boris Johnson still says he wants to have a general election, but at this moment, the opposition parties aren't going to back that. And when it comes to the big quagmire they're all in politically, how we sort out the Brexit mess, well, it doesn't necessarily change that much immediately either.
Laura, we'll talk a little more about that later on, but thanks very much for now. Laura Kuenssberg there, our political editor, with more analysis a little later. By any measure, of course, the ruling represents a crushing defeat for Mr Johnson, as Laura was saying, for the Cabinet and for those advisers who were involved in the original decision. The Supreme Court was highly critical of the government's case. So what does this mean for the relationship between courts and government, and what impact could it have in the future? Our home editor, Mark Easton, has this report.
What you're watching never happened. It may look as though in the small hours of September the 10th, the Royal Commissioners attended the House of Lords to suspend or prorogue Parliament, but today the most senior judges in the land said the ceremony was void and had no effect.
To prorogue this present Parliament.
When the Royal Commissioners walked into the House of Lords, it was as if they had walked in with a blank sheet of paper. Parliament has not been prorogued. This is the unanimous judgment of all 11 justices.
This was a constitutional thwack on the nose of government, delivered by the judiciary on behalf of the UK Parliament. The justices made it clear this judgment was a one-off, but its implications will echo down British history.
Around Parliament Square in Westminster, there are hidden power lines, a triangle of authority that joins the Houses of Parliament, the government focused on 10 Downing Street, and the judiciary and the Supreme Court. Today, the justices explained that a fundamental principle of British democracy is that the Prime Minister is accountable to Parliament. They also stated that the courts had supervised the lawfulness of government for centuries. Established in 2009 to replace the Law Lords as the UK's most senior judicial body, today saw the Supreme Court beginning to flex its constitutional muscles.
This is probably the biggest day in the history of the Supreme Court so far. With this unanimous judgment, the judges have really set down a marker about their role as a constitutional court, as a check on government and as a defender of parliamentary sovereignty. And although this will have some repercussions for Brexit, it's really much bigger than that. This is about how our parliamentary democracy works.
The Supreme Court is crossing the line, meddling in politics, Downing Street has suggested, but the justices were adamant they had a responsibility to question the motives of the Prime Minister, pointing out he'd failed to submit a witness statement to explain under oath his reasons for suspending Parliament. The only evidence the Supreme Court says it's had was this memo sent by Nicky de Costa, Boris Johnson's advisor, recommending suspension. Boris Johnson ticked yes.
This was not a normal prorogation in the run-up to a Queen's speech.
This is a completely proper constitutional procedure.
When Jacob Rees-Mogg, as leader of the House of Commons, went to Balmoral to advise the Queen to suspend Parliament, advice she was obliged to accept, the process was unlawful, the justices said. And in a direct criticism of Boris Johnson, the judgment suggested he ignored constitutional responsibilities in favour of party political self-interest. Nowhere is there a hint that the Prime Minister, in giving advice to Her Majesty, is more than simply the leader of the government, seeking to promote its own policies, the justices said.
It is not clear to us that any step is needed from the Prime Minister, but if it is, the Court is pleased that his counsel have told the Court that he will take all necessary steps to comply with the terms of any declaration made by this Court.
Tomorrow morning, Parliament will sit once more, its sovereign place in our democracy restored and enhanced. But it won't be a fresh dawn. Today's judgment means it opens its doors as though the Prime Minister had never closed them. Mark Easton, BBC News, Parliament Square.
Well, with me tonight, outside Parliament, is our legal correspondent, Clive Coleman, who's been following this in great detail. Let's talk about the process and the importance of it, Clive, that led to today's ruling.
OK, let's just say one thing about today's ruling. This is not about the merits of Brexit, but let's just stand back and recognise the enormity of what it is. This is a serving Prime Minister of the United Kingdom who's been found unanimously by the highest court in the land to have unlawfully advised the monarch of the realm to suspend the sovereign body in our constitution, Parliament, at a time of national crisis, with the effect that his government is not scrutinised during that period. The stuff of far-fetched TV dramas, perhaps, but it happened, and it happened because of something called judicial review. That's a process whereby individuals, you or I, can go before a court and ask independent judges to rule on whether a decision of a public body, could be a minister, could be the Prime Minister, is lawful or not. And that points up, I think, a critical tension in our constitution between, on the one hand, a powerful executive government used to getting its way, but on the other, a small group of independent judges who, through the mechanism of judicial review, can halt the might of government in its tracks if what ministers have done is unlawful. Now, political decision-making by judges, that's what some people will say, but today is a very firm reminder that no one is above the law.
Clive, thanks very much again for that analysis. Clive Coleman, our legal correspondent there. Well, government officials confirmed tonight that the Prime Minister has in fact spoken to Her Majesty the Queen following today's Supreme Court ruling, but they refused to say whether Mr Johnson had apologised to the Queen. Our Scotland correspondent Lorna Gordon is outside the Queen's residence at Balmoral. And Lorna, what's been said there this evening?
Yeah, well, we've had no comment from Buckingham Palace, no official reaction from Buckingham Palace to that Supreme Court ruling, save to confirm that conversation between Boris Johnson and the Queen did take place earlier today. We don't know the contents of that conversation, as you said. We don't know whether the Prime Minister apologised to the Queen for putting her in that tricky position, which frankly kicked off 4 weeks ago tomorrow, when those 3 Privy Council members, led by Jacob Rees-Mogg, came here to Balmoral, interrupted the Queen during her summer holiday and advised her to prorogue Parliament. You know, I think this ruling and the court cases that preceded it have shone a light on the relationship between the monarchy and her government. You know, the Queen and her advisors have worked very hard over the many decades of her reign to keep her above politics, keep her neutral. And the whole point of a constitutional monarchy is that politicians do not do things that may embarrass the Queen or expose her to criticism or question. And I think there will be many that feel that Boris Johnson's actions have put the monarchy this evening in a very uncomfortable position, at the very least cast a shadow on the relationship between the monarchy and her government going forward.
Lorna, thanks very much again. Lorna Gordon with the latest there at Balmoral. So away from all the tension and drama here at Westminster, what do voters in other parts of the UK make of what's happened here? This week, BBC News has been reporting from Stoke-on-Trent, the city with the highest Leave vote back in 2016. And our political correspondent Alex Forsyth has been getting views from there and from Altrincham, which voted Remain.
BBC Radio Stoke.
Wherever the phone in, it seems there's a prevalent view. Leave or Remain, people are simply fed up with how Brexit's been handled.
I just don't know anymore. I've just lost the will to live. I can't be bothered with a lot of it anymore.
Local electrician Gary is a regular radio caller who doesn't think today's ruling will change many minds.
I don't think to Joe Public it will make one iota of difference. The same people who were backing Boris were backing, now. I just think he should get on with it like most people.
In Stoke, such frustration is rife. More people here voted to leave than any other city in the UK. And as well as confusion about what happens now, there's as much anger at the slow wrangling in Westminster as at Boris Johnson's actions.
Well, at least Boris Johnson's trying to get something done.
I think it's disgusting what they're doing to him. I think he's a good Prime Minister.
If the court says it's unlawful, it's unlawful. And but the question now begs, where do we go from here?
They should just back him and let him get on with it.
Even though the court said it's unlawful, he's effectively gone against the law.
What he's done, they've said is unlawful, but I think the guy has got the country at heart. He's trying to get us a deal and get us out of what we voted for.
That's exactly the view Number 10 is counting on. Their strategy is to win support in areas that voted Leave, like here in the Midlands and the North, places the Tories will target if there's an election, and where they hope Boris Johnson's do-or-die Brexit attitude, even the fact he's pitting himself against Parliament, will play well with voters. But that doesn't work everywhere.
In Altrincham, most people voted to Remain, and the Prime Minister's approach hasn't gone down well with some.
I'm a Conservative lifelong and haven't trusted the man forever. So what we're getting is exactly what we deserved.
We don't have a law in this country for nothing. If he's done wrong, he should be punished for it.
I think he definitely should reconsider his position and maybe change his tactics a little bit.
Back in Stoke, these students attend Staffordshire Uni from across the country. All welcome today's court ruling, but no Parliament returning won't provide simple answers.
Parliament is split just like the country. It's split down the middle. We're in this situation. We need to come up with a solid solution that everyone is going to agree on.
You need everyone across the board to work together. And I know that's hard at the moment with everybody, kind of at each other's necks. But again, what Brexit is doing is it's tearing communities apart.
Split views on the government's actions don't, of course, depend on location, but frustration at this whole Brexit process seems to be cross-country. Alex Forsyth, BBC News, Stoke-on-Trent.